On this episode of Locked On Lightning, we're talking about 3 trades that need to happen this season. Can the Lightning pull off these moves? All that coming up and more on Locked On Lightning.
You're Locked On Lightning, your daily podcast on the Tampa Bay Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome to another episode of Locked On Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Adam Danker. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Locked On Lightning. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. On this episode of Locked On Lightning, we're talking about 3 trades that need to happen for the Tampa Bay Lightning this season. We break down the players, we break down the reasons why, as well as can it happen. But before we grab any of those topics, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Give us a follow wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. We're also available on YouTube, so go ahead, subscribe to our channel there. Hit that notification button so as soon as the newest episode drops, you'll be notified. So I thought it would be appropriate to talk about, some moves that might be made. I will be putting out some content on Bolts by the Bay, some articles detailing all this stuff, so keep an eye out for that. But there is, even though it's been very quiet for not only the Tampa Bay Lightning the last couple of weeks, really the month since free agency started, there is still a lot of work I think this team needs to be done on the roster in order for them to get to where I think we could get to a place where all of us as people who watch this team and listen to this team can be in a spot where we could feel comfortable about this team, not only going out and winning hockey games, but can go the distance eventually and get to where we want. And that is obviously a Stanley Cup. I did talk about on the last episode about how really part of this season, I think really the storyline will be, or really should be rather, is this team can put themselves in a good position as long as everybody plays well. And it was pointed out by a previous listener on our YouTube page, which they were absolutely right. There's a lot of ifs involved here, but I think that it can happen if everything I detailed on that episode happens. And I think that really it really depends on whether or not Julian Brees-Boss feels comfortable enough going into the season with the roster looking as it does. Even though there's a lot of salary cap issues still with this team, you can make moves. There is players that you can move here and there and tweak, and we're talking about that on today's show. So we're talking about the 3 players that I think really should be traded this year. I have no ill will near them, of course. I mean, it's just when you're not a fit, you're not a fit. So we're looking at first Erik Cernak, we're looking at Connor Sherry, and then we're wrapping things up with Nick Pervix. And starting off with Erik Cernak. The thing with Erik Cernak, and I think that a lot of Lightning fans can agree on this, is that he has just not lived up to expectations since Ryan McDonough was traded to Nashville. Now, obviously, he is back in Tampa, but I think that it kind of was a telling sign as to what kind of player he is, and a player that, obviously the Lightning don't really, they need him to be better than obviously what he has given us over the last couple of years. And on top of all of that, really what it comes down to is that the guy cannot stay healthy. And we all know defensemen, they get dinged up. It happens. It's part of the position. You can't really fault them. But I alluded to it on the last podcast, how, there's 3 things certain in this life: death, taxes, and Erik Cernak getting hurt. That's just a matter of fact. And I think that really, if you are going about trading a guy like Erik Cernak, now obviously he has a no trade clause, but there are ways around that, as we have seen with certain situations around the NHL, as well as with other players, especially with the Lightning. Most recently, the best case scenario for that, or best example, really has been what we saw with the New York Rangers and former Lightning player Barclay Goodrow. Just because a player has a no trade clause, they could waive that, obviously. And the one thing is that, especially then, you can put a player on waivers, and really at the end of the day, it's kind of more so of a who blinks kind of first thing, and really I don't hope that the Lightning get to a situation with any player like that. It's just not good for business, especially if you continue to do it. As well as I think, we can't really compare the Rangers and the Lightning right now. They're just two teams that are in kind of different positions right now, where I think we could agree the Rangers are a little bit of a more of a must-win mode right now than the Lightning are. I think the Lightning have kind of taken a step back, but at the same time, the expectations have not been lowered. And with Erik Cernak, I think really it's going to be a very important season for him, considering the fact that could very well be something that it could be a reality after the next season. And I think that really he needs to become that player that we discussed, or really hope that he would be once McDonough was traded. And even then, though you got McDonough back, that's no guarantee that he is going to be able to carry over the performance that we saw him have in Nashville, to be able to kind of look the other way on Cernak. I think it will be more eyes will be on Cernak than ever before. But I think that really in the long run, just with the way his contract is set up, which I think we could all agree, even at the time, it was just not a good deal to be given to a guy like that really just A, misses a lot of games, B, I know the long-term outlook is, well, in a couple of years, regardless of performance, maybe, as long as the salary cap continues to rise, this contract won't be as much of a burden to the Lightning. But at the end of the day, really what it comes down to, and I think for a lot of Lightning fans, including myself, is that Erik Cernak's not worth $5.2 million. That's just the reality of the situation. And really in this era, I guess if you want to call it, in Lightning hockey, every dollar counts. And I think that now the next conversation that will be had, now that we've established that, yeah, Erik Cernak needs to go, I mean, it kind of has been talked about quite a bit, which is why a lot of people, I think, were surprised when Sergachev was traded. I think that as for who will have to, or where you might move Erik Cernak, it's really a toss-up. I don't think that if he does get moved, it's not going to be before the season. I think regardless of how well the Lightning are playing, if you can trade him at the deadline, that should be a move that you should explore. And I'm looking at the Lightning defensive core right now. We should not have to live in a world where, or have a situation in Tampa Bay where Lilleberg and Perbix should be kind of being flip-flopped out of the lineup. I mean, really, the reality of the situation is, and we'll talk about this more with Nick Perbix, is how really both those guys, if they're on your roster, they should be playing. I know that may be controversial to some other people who feel a certain type of way about Perbix, but the best way to do that, take away that possible conflict, is just try to find a way to do something with Erik Cernak. And I think if you move him, it's going to be to a playoff team that is going to be desperate for defense. I don't think Cernak really needs to have a Norris Trophy season for a team to gain interest. I think if we see the kind of player that he was during the Cup runs and as well as the run against the Avalanche, I think that really you could sell that to a team. Now, obviously, there's definitely going to be some salary retention in any deal. regarding Eric Chernak. You're almost going to have to pay a team to take him. So that involves draft picks or even a prospect, which, quite frankly, it shouldn't cost you that much unless you overbid, which obviously that is in the back of everybody's mind when you're talking about Julien Brisebois. I think a lot of people still get flashbacks, myself included, when we talk about Julien Brisebois and his negotiating skills, and we get taken back immediately to Tanner Jeannot and the deal that was made with the Nashville Predators at the time. But the likelihood of him getting traded for the season, I think, is below zero, if you even want to throw it down that far. The possibility of him getting traded this year, I think, is maybe 20%. I think that, though, it is very important you try to figure out how to, unless he completely comes back and has a phenomenal season, you have to kind of plan for moving on from him, whether it's even a season in advance. And really, I think that Eric Chernak is aware of that, or he at least should be. Because, I mean, the reality of the situation, if what happened with Steven Stamkos was any indication of what this franchise is doing and what their mindset is now, they're not above hurting people's feelings in order to get better. And that's really what some of the best teams in the league do, organizational wise, and the Lightning need to follow suit. So I really hope that it doesn't come down to a situation in which, we're talking about like Eric Chernak needs to get traded or this or that. And I really hope he has a good season and we could kind of look back on this and say, well, maybe we overreacted, or maybe, we're glad things got better. Let me know in the comments below what you think about all that. I mean, I think with Chernak, he's out of all the people, all the three guys that we'll be talking about today, he's probably the least likely to get traded. Now, the next two we'll be talking about most likely will be moving on from them at one point or another, whether it's during the contract expiration time or just trading them. So we'll continue to talk about that coming up in just a little bit. We're talking about Connor Sherry. I bet a lot of people have a lot of things to say about that, so we'll talk about that coming up. But first, let's talk about our first sponsor on today's show, and that is our friends over at Game Time. Now, Game Time is the number one place to get your tickets, or to sporting events, to theater events, wherever you want to get tickets. Game Time is the place to go, because with last minute deals, all in prices and views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. Now, they have these last minute deals that are phenomenal. It almost feels like you're stealing, because you could save up to 60% off buying last minute for sports, concert, comedy, theater, whatever it is, they have it. Save even more with exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game or the event. They also have this awesome toggling feature that shows the total up front with no surprise fees at checkout. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. So as always, I want to thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. If you haven't already done so, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Give us a follow wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. We're also available on YouTube. Subscribe to our channel there. Hit that notification button so as soon as the newest episode drops, you'll be notified. So keep an eye out for that, for those episodes, as well as some of my content that I'd be coming out with on boltsbythebay.com. We have a lot of great writers come in the mix for this season. We'll be dropping a lot of content, Lightning related, biggest storylines surrounding this team, as well as one of them, three players who we think should be traded this season. We already talked about Eric Chernak. Now we're looking at Connor Sherry, or Sherry, however you want to pronounce it. It is pronounced Sherry, but after years of calling him Sherry, how can you not just call him Sherry? So I have to say, out of every player that we have discussed over the last couple of years, really within the time that I've done this podcast, I have to say Connor Sherry is probably the most disliked Lightning player that I have seen. And it's rightfully so, rightfully warranted. He just has not really impressed us at all from day one. He has spent a bulk amount of time either just being out of the lineup, whether it be being hurt or just switched out for roster moves or whatever the case may be. You know, there was some hope there when he was first signed last year that he was going to come in, add a little bit of veteran leadership, be able to produce somewhat, and to be able to help this team get in the right direction. Now, obviously, that hasn't been the case. He has just underperformed to the point to where it's been very disappointing. I have compared it oftentimes to being kind of a Vlad Nemestikov situation, what we saw the year prior. Vlad Nemestikov, as we all know, was brought in, former Lightning player, and was just absolutely atrocious. Connor Sherry, I would say, is probably in a close second for probably, at least in recent memory. I'm sure there's some Lightning fans out there that have some even better performances of players being brought in and just being somewhat of a non-factor. And Sherry, the worst part about this, he's entering into his mid-30s soon. He has at least another year after this one, making $2 million. And my thing, he also has a no-trade clause, which is wild. That that has been my big pet peeve out of this administration or this organization, whatever you want to call it. It's been my biggest pet peeve when signing contracts. And I get it, players want security, and that's the best way to get them to sign, and where other teams may not offer that security. Completely understandable, but giving a no-trade clause, a no-movement deal to a guy like this, coming from Washington, yeah, he had decent numbers there, had a little bit of a rejuvenation in his career. Comes to Tampa, and you always have to run the risk of a guy just not being able to gel into the system. And that's exactly what happened. I mean, Sherry has had little flirtations with success in Tampa Bay, but for the most part, he has just been very, very disappointing. And I think that really the Lightning have locked themselves into a situation in which they are unable to part ways with him. Unless you could find a deal to where, and we talked about this with Chernak, we've talked about this with numerous players on this team. Nick Pervix will definitely be one that we will talk about at the end of this episode. How really you're almost going to have to pay more to get rid of these guys. Sherry is a player that obviously to a lot of NHL teams is not going to be a sexy candidate or a sexy target to pick up on their team, and I don't blame him. He has been surrounded with very good talent around him, at least within his time here. I think that for the most part, he has been put in a situation to succeed, and we just haven't seen anything come from it. I talked about it quite a number of times over the course of the season, where you would never know he was on this team if the announcers didn't announce his game during the lineup announcements. And that tells you something. And it's unfortunate that this is a situation that they're in. And now really the next step here is, what can you do with him other than bury him in the lineup? Because you can't let him sit on the bench for $2 million a year. That's ridiculous. But and you certainly can't put him on the fourth line. I think if anything, you are just opening yourself up to another liability. I mean, not the fourth. The fourth line. I mean, I can't see him holding it down with Luke Glendening and Chaffee, which, on the other hand, I think it's almost a travesty that you have to put him, you're forced to put him on the third line with Paul and Esimont, while Mitch Chaffee has to kind of go back to square one with all of this after really having a good showing in his first year in the NHL. I think the hope here is, at least within the organization, when it comes down to it, and it's really sad that we're talking about this, is that you're hoping with the addition of Jake Getsel, those two obviously have history playing together in Pittsburgh and winning a cup or two. I think they were there. I believe Getsel has one and Sherry has one. I could be wrong about that. But those two played very well together in Pittsburgh. And I think that's part of the thinking in Tampa Bay is that you give Sherry one last shot, maybe throw him on the ice at certain points with Getzel, especially in practice too. You want to see how they gel together, if any of that old chemistry comes back. But I think that the experiment between those two will be very short-lived if it doesn't work. And I'm talking about not even a handful of games. And I think that really, what do you do after that? You can't trade him unless you just completely nail it in and say to Team X, let us get a 7th round pick or a very probably. I don't even think Sherry's is worth a top 20 prospect in an organization. I mean, it depends on the prospect, but you're going to have to really sell low just to part ways, because like I alluded to at Mitchell Chafee, all you're doing is with these players, with Chernak, with Sherry, with Pervix, all you're doing is just holding back the progression of younger players coming out of Syracuse, because that's really what I think should be the main focus from this team this year, is let the young guys play, something that we have been almost screaming about to a certain extent over the last couple of years, especially as you bring up these young players and they prove that they could play. And then you have to say the next year, hold up, young gun, we got to let this player, because we're paying, we made a terrible contract decision. And I hope that the Sherry deal, I hope that, these deals and these contracts that Brisebois has made that have come back to bite him, I hope this is a learning experience for him. And who knows, maybe his head wasn't in the right place last year, and that's why he just had an abysmal showing. But it doesn't also help that he is undersized, because really what else does he bring to the table? Can't play physical. Obviously, he's here to score and produce and put up points. Clearly, we didn't see that. So you're also running out of ways to try and sell this guy to a potential team. So do the Lightning trade him this year? Absolutely not. I would be shocked. I would be shocked if that were the case, if that was something that were to happen, unless they completely, unless they work out a deal, which I spoke about a little. I think it was like right before free agency started, as the Sergachev deal. Right, I think it was like right before the Sergachev deal happened. I think you got to work out a deal where you could package all these guys together, because then you could kind of rip the Band-Aid off at once, and you don't have to, once you get rid of one piece, you don't have to say, oh, now we got to figure this out, and now we're a little depleted on a selling point. No, I think if you get rid of Chernak, Sherry, and Perbix, as we'll talk about him on to close out the show, I think that's the best way to approach it, because really, outside of Chernak, you can't really, you don't really have a way to sell these guys. And that's really what it is. You can't just call up a team. There's really no team in the NHL anymore. The Coyotes are gone. They're in a different mindset now, that team, moving to Utah. Different ownership. They're gone are the days of them saying, let's retain salary and we'll take nothing really. We'll just be a middleman for you to make big deals. No, that is gone. And the teams that are at the bottom of the barrel right now that are in sell mode, I doubt those teams are going to take a Connor Sherry, an Eric Chernak, maybe a Nick Pervix. I think out of all of them, he's a little bit more attractive as well. Not as broken down, but as a Chernak. But it's also really dependent on the team. So let me know in the comments below. I mean, really, what do the Lightning do with Sherry in next offseason? Do you just cut your losses and let him go? Because I mean, he's still got one more year. You can't really, I don't think you could survive another season, because especially you are in win now mode. The clocks are ticking on Hedman and Kucherov. I still believe at least Kuch is in his prime, but still, you don't want to take any chances. And you got to make every season count from now until then, until these guys start to deteriorate in performance. So let me know in the comments below. And coming up, we're going to wrap things up with Nick Pervix. I mean, it's a very curious situation that is happening in Tampa Bay with some of these players. A situation that I feel like has not gotten enough attention. I feel like a lot of people are just content with what this is. And even though I do firmly believe that this team can win as long as they play the right way, as like I said, it was pointed out, and I completely agree. A lot of ifs involved, and really it depends on what John Cooper could do and his coaching staff could do to kind of wrangle this team and rally them into playing better. Because I do feel like this team can play better than what is on paper. So we're going to talk about Pervix coming up in just a bit, but first we're going to wrap things up with our last sponsor, and that is our friends over at Indeed.Com. Now, in today's world, we're driven by the search for better, but when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. And Indeed doesn't just help you hire faster. 93% of employers agree Indeed delivers the highest quality matches compared to other job sites, according to a recent Indeed survey. So join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire the great talent fast. And listeners of the show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. So one last time, I want to thank you all for making us your first listener of the day. If you haven't already done so, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Give us a follow wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. We're also available on YouTube. Subscribe to our channel there. Hit that notification button so as soon as the newest episode drops, you'll be notified and be able to tune in to some of the stories and really news that are surrounding this team. I know it's a dead period for the NHL, but I mean, the storylines don't stop. I mean, just because there's not that much going on doesn't mean there's not much talk about. There is 3 players on this team that I really think that can outplay what I think that's also wishful thinking. I do believe that we can see a reality in which or a situation in which these players can play at a level that is reasonable for us to be okay. This team can win games. But you have really in the end, especially 2 on the back end, you have 3 players that really just aren't cutting it and really are just making too much money to where you can't really overlook it. And really that's the thing that is worrying me most about these Lightning players. When you look at these players, really, I mean, you have 3 players making a little over $8 million where just doesn't cut it for you, or a little under. My math was a little fuzzy today, so don't jump on me about that. But the fact of the matter is that you're also in a situation where you can't move them. Oftentimes you could kind of figure things out, whether it be just cutting ties, sending them somewhere else. But especially with a guy like Nick Pervix, who has just been another massive disappointment. And I think his situation is a little bit more easier to resolve, or at least the end of the tunnel is a lot closer than Sherry and Chernak, where Chernak has a little bit more than a little under a handful of years left with this team. Sherry's got 1 more season after this on the books. Nick Pervix, could very well be and most likely will be his last year in Tampa. He got out to a pretty good start to his NHL career, as we all know. Really impressed a lot of people. Had 9 goals his first year. And I think that the reason why we were all very impressed, because this was just kind of a thing that just came out of the woodworks. He was really just intended to be a roster replacement. Off the top of my head, I don't really remember who was the player that was injured at the time. If I had to guess, it was probably Hedman or Chernak even. But the fact of the matter is that not only did he surprise everyone, but he also played his way into the good graces of John Cooper, which is why he has gotten a ton of chances since he has been here. Now, yes, he does have his moments throughout the course of games where he can impress us and make one good play that will, stop a player with the puck on a sequence, or one good play along the boards where he kicks it out of the zone and the Lightning could get a line change. Little things like that. But I just, like I said, in this era of Lightning hockey where every dollar counts, you can't, it's really almost, and also with who you have in Syracuse that you could bring up, you shouldn't have a guy on your third line right now making a little over $1 million a year. I just don't think that's a reasonable thing to do. Even though I just stated that he does do some very positive things for this team at times, there are moments where, or really games rather, where he's another one. You could go a couple of games actually without even remembering that he plays for this team. Now, with certain defensemen, yeah, that is a good thing. The less you hear of them, the better. But coupled with that usually are stretches where this team is not playing well defensively. Now, it of course doesn't all fall on him, but he is also still part of the problem. Now, this might seem like some Nick Purvix hate. It's not. It's just the reality of the situation. There are better opportunities. There are better players out there. I was a big proponent heading into the offseason that the Lightning should look for a deal for him and should have kept Hayden Fleury, the cheaper and less costly option, as well as a guy who I think is a little bit more stable defensively, could kind of play a little bit of a 200-foot game, where Nick Purvix doesn't, in my opinion, especially on the third line, where really the third line combination for defensemen is to go out there and just play stalwart for your team and to disrupt. I don't see him being able to fit into that role. He's not that player. Quite frankly, I don't know what kind of player Nick Purvix is. He's not overly impressive defensively. He's not overly impressive offensively. He's not overly a physical player. I don't know if I feel comfortable enough really classifying him as a bottom 4 defenseman. I just don't. I don't know where to classify him. If anything, he is a role player. You switch him out depending on the team that you're playing. And that's what I think we're going to see out of him this year, really the extent of his last season in Tampa, is that he is going to be that kind of player when a player gets hurt or the Lightning don't like a matchup with Lilleberg, whatever team they might be playing. You're going to see that. You're going to see Purvix thrown into those roles. It's unfortunate that there's a situation like this, especially because the coach is very much in favor of this player. But it's just one of those things where I don't see a trade scenario for this guy happening. I just, especially, maybe a team that is a fringe playoff team. Purvix is having a little bit of a better year. But I think we're all in agreement. Lilleberg's the future, at least in that role on the third line. You have other defensemen coming up through the system that can play at the NHL level, in my opinion. If you get a deal where you get really next to nothing back with a fringe playoff team, and when I say fringe, I mean second wild card spot, coming out of the West, preferably, I would hate for the Lightning to make a deal with a team that is coming out of the East, fringe playoff team, and somehow that bites you in the butt. Because, yeah, the Lightning, I've picked them to be a top 3 team in the division this year, preferably 2 and 3, because I think the Panthers are still going to be good. But it could also be a situation in which the Lightning are fighting for a spot going into March. and might need a little bit more scoring. And I think that Perbix can be put in a situation with some draft picks, possibly. Who knows? Who knows what kind of mood Julian Brisebois is in this year? But scenario in which you could do that. Working a deal like, we're going to give you draft picks, top line draft picks. Here you go. Take Nick Perbix off our hands, at least for the rest of the season. I mean, but at that point, is it really worth it? So a lot of question marks still, a lot of answers given out, but still more questions abound from that. And I just, it's unfortunate. Like I said before, it's a situation in which really the Lightning have signed their way into a situation in which they really can't get themselves out of. So we'll see what they could do, see how creative Julian Brisebois will get this season. Like I said, I'm still in the camp of if you could trade all three guys at once and get something of value back, which really if you're trading all three guys at once, you should at least get, a third line forward or something from a team that is out of it. Maybe a Flames. I mean, I have to look at their roster because I know they're selling. That would work perfectly for the Lightning, or maybe even the Ducks, teams like that out of the West especially. So let me know in the comments below where you stand on these players. Can they get traded? I just don't think Perbix will get traded. I think really, if anybody, it's going to be Chernak. But we'll have to sit and wait like everybody else. So in the meantime, that's been it for this episode of Locked On Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Adam Danker. I'll talk to you in the next one.